Their neighbors are watching. Ramaphosa step in as Zimbabwe's crisis goes regional. Muria Zimbabwe, welcome back, Pamzinda Wevan. We have been covering this crisis from inside Zimbabwe. The T-shirts, the generals, the death threats, the military covenants, the constitutional amendments, and all of that is real, and all of it matters. But the story leaves Zimbabwe's borders. Because when a sitting SADC chair makes a private visit to a neighboring country to tell its president to stop what he's doing, that is not just a Zimbabwe story anymore. That is a regional story, a continental story, and it means the world is watching more closely than anyone in State House wants it to admit it. Cyril Ramaphosa, South Africa's president and the current interim SADC chair, has reportedly made a high-stakes visit to Zimbabwe, not a state visit, not a formal summit, a private visit, the kind of visit that happens when things are too serious for official protocol and too urgent for scheduled diplomacy, the kind of visit that says we need to talk now quietly before this gets worse. And the message he reportedly carried was simple and direct. ED, what you are doing with Cape 3 is dangerous, not just for Zimbabwe, for all of us. Let us break down why the region is alarmed and what the September 18th bombshell means for everything. Murez Babo, we have been talking about May 18th as the critical date, the first reading of Cape 3, the parliament vote, the moment that defines Zimbabwe's constitutional future. But this report drops a new date that changes the entire timeline, and it is more alarming than anything we have discussed before. Zimbabwe, reports now indicate that the actual plan, the real plan, is to introduce the bill formally in Parliament on September 18th, 2026. And connected to that date is the most audacious constitutional maneuver we have seen yet, the zero-year strategy. Here is how it works. The current presidential term began after the disputed 2023 elections. If Cape 3 passes and changes terms from 5 years to 7, Mnangagwa's team intends to argue that his current term does not count as a full term. Why? Because under the new 7-year framework, a term of less than 3 years, which his current shortened term allegedly qualifies as, should not be counted at all. Zimbabwe, which means if they push this through before September 2026, they can argue he gets a completely fresh 7-year term, starting from scratch, running all the way to 2033. Keep your eyes on 2033. If Cape 3 becomes law before September 2026, this is the danger we could all face. This must concern everyone. ZANU-PF supporters would have been sold a ruse should that cause be adopted. By every lawful means available, we must stop this unfolding madness. First price, we stop the amendment. In the event we can't do that, we stop them from amending prior to September 2026. That was Advocate Tabanpov, a constitutional lawyer, warning us in plain language about exactly this strategy. Stop the bill entirely, and if you cannot stop it from passing before September, because the September date is the tripwire. Cross it, and 2033 becomes legally arguable. This is not propaganda, family. This is constitutional arithmetic, and the people running this operation know exactly what they are doing. Why is SADC alarmed? The refugee crisis argument. Now, let us talk about why Ramaphosa is personally involved, why SADC is alarmed, because the answer might surprise you. It is not primarily about democracy, not primarily about constitutional principles. It is about something far more immediate and practical for South Africa. Between 4 and 6 million Zimbabweans are currently estimated to be living in South Africa. 4 to 6 million people. That is more than the entire population of many African countries. Zimbabwe. People who left Zimbabwe because the economy collapsed. Because there were no jobs because the healthcare system failed, because the education system failed, because decades of governance catastrophe made staying in Zimbabwe impossible for millions of families. In South Africa, which has its own unemployment crisis, its own service delivery failures, its own political pressures, is carrying that weight. Every time Zimbabwe's political temperature rises, every time economic conditions worsen, every time another crisis erupts in Harare, South Africa feels it. It feels it in its border queues, its hospitals, its townships, its labor markets. So when Ramaphosa looks at Cape 3, at the prospect of Mnangagwa staying until 2030 or 2033, at the continued economic dysfunction that produces that refugee flow, he is not just looking at it as a democratic principles question. He is looking at it as a South African domestic issue. More instability in Zimbabwe means more Zimbabweans in South Africa. And South Africa's voters are already asking hard questions about that. Civil society groups have been pleading with SADC Chair Ramaphosa to intervene in Zimbabwe as a bill currently before Parliament would allow Mnangagwa to stay in power beyond his constitutional limits. And the regional contrast is damning. Botswana just held elections and transferred power peacefully. Mozambique held elections, contested and difficult, but held. Lesotho navigated its political transition. The regional trend is toward constitutional compliance, imperfect, messy, but moving in the right direction. And then there is Zimbabwe, moving visibly, loudly in the opposite direction, becoming the regional outlier. The cautionary tale, the country that SADC has to manage rather than celebrate. That is what Ramaphosa went to Harare to say. That's why he came into Harare. Chiwenga in Mtari, one man, one vote. Right. And while Ramaphosa was delivering that message at the diplomatic level, Chiwenga was delivering his own message at the popular level. Speaking in Mtari, Manicaland, his symbolic home ground, the vice president issued a reminder that has been reverberating across Zimbabwe ever since. The liberation struggle was fought for one man, one vote, full stop. Not one man, one parliamentary selection process controlled by a party with a supermajority. Not one man, one 7-year term decided by MPs who received residential stands and cash envelopes. One man, one vote, directly, personally, freely. Chiwenga has positioned himself as the guardian of the liberation struggle's core principles, asserting that the fight for Zimbabwe's independence was primarily for land and the sacred principle of one man, one vote. This stance directly challenges Mnangagwa's proposed constitutional changes, which Chiwenga views as an affront to these foundational tenets. And the response from pro-Mnangagwa youth groups, threats of war if the third term bid is opposed, war, said publicly by groups affiliated with the ruling faction, against anyone who dares defend the constitution. Mure Zimbabwe, when your own supporters are threatening war against constitutional opposition, you have already lost the moral argument. You have already considered that you cannot win on the merits, and you are left with only intimidation, which is historically the last resort of a faction that knows it is losing. The G4 wildcard, Mure Zimbabwe, the enemy of my enemy. Now, here is the angle that most people are not covering, and it adds a completely new layer of complexity to this whole picture. The prevailing narrative of a simple binary struggle between Mnangagwa and Chiwenga misses the structural complexity of ZANU-PF. Chiwenga is not just fighting Mnangagwa. He is navigating landscapes still haunted by the G40, the Mugabe loyalists. Figures like Jonathan Moyo have adopted a posture of tactical support for the ED 2030 agenda. This support is not born of loyalty to Mnangagwa, but of a deep-seated vendetta against the men who led the 2017 tanks. By backing Cape 3, the G4 remnants ensure the military faction remains locked out of the presidency indefinitely. Let that sink in. Jonathan Moyo, Grace Mugabe's closest political ally, is reportedly supporting Cape 3. I mean, we know this. Not because he loves Mnangagwa, because he hates Chiwenga. Because Chiwenga is the man who rolled the tanks that ended everything Moyo had built alongside Mugabe. And if Cape 3 passes and kills Chiwenga's presidential ambitions permanently, Moyo gets his revenge, even from exile. This is Zimbabwe politics at its most Byzantine family, where enemies of enemies become tactical allies, where a man in exile begs a constitutional amendment he ideologically opposes, purely to neutralize the general he has never forgiven. The politics of vendetta, masquerading as the politics of constitutional reform. Vanavev, in the middle of all of this, the ordinary Zimbabwean, the vendor, the nurse, the teacher, the young officer doing the mathematics in the barracks, watching this extraordinary spectacle of powerful men fighting over the furniture in a house that was never really theirs to own. Let us learn this clearly. When a neighboring head of state makes a private visit to tell you to stop what you are doing, that is not a routine diplomatic courtesy. That is a warning delivered with the weight of regional consensus behind it and delivered privately, which is actually more serious than a public statement because it means the conversation that follows cannot be dismissed as grandstanding or interference for the most domestic political purposes. For Chiwenga to succeed now, he would either have to rule by force, establishing a hard military junta, which would trigger total international pariah status and SADC intervention, or he must work within the system, which is precisely what Mnangagwa has spent 2 years systematically dismantling. So everyone is trapped. Mnangagwa cannot push Cape 3 through without international alarm and regional pressure. Chiwenga cannot move against it through force without triggering SADC intervention. The parliament cannot vote freely while MPs are being bought and intimidated. And the people who would vote down this bill in a referendum by an overwhelming margin have been deliberately excluded from the referendum that would make their voice definitive. September 18th, that is the new date to watch. That is the tripwire. That is the moment when 2033 either becomes possible or when enough resistance, enough regional pressure, enough institutional pushback, and enough Zimbabwean voices saying no forces a different outcome. Ramaphosa came to Harare, the region is watching, the military covenant is broken, the generals are speaking, the students are still being abducted for holding flyers, and the vice president is standing in Mtare saying, we fought for one man, one vote, and we meant it. What side of that history do you want to be on? Drop your thoughts, family. Is Ramaphosa's intervention too late, too late? Or does regional pressure change the calculation from Mnangagwa? And can anything stop the September 18th strategy? This is your boy, Pamzinga Wevan, fearless, always pro-democracy, forever. Peace.